Catherine Liang had been awake since 3, which was not unusual for her. 23 years of running Liang Capital had produced in her a specific relationship with sleep. She took it in whatever intervals were available, and she stopped requiring it at its full 8-hour ration sometime in her mid-40s, around the same time that the spinal cord injury had reorganized what her mornings required, which was no longer the run she had started every day with since graduate school, and was now the specific and methodical 30-minute regimen that her physiatrist had designed, and that she had maintained with the same discipline she applied to everything that mattered. The call was from her attorney, Robert Huang. He said, "Catherine." And then he said the specific thing that attorneys said when they called at 4:47 in the morning, which was that something was wrong in a way that required the attorney to be the one who called rather than a paralegal or an associate. He said, "The SEC has issued a temporary restraining order on Liang Capital. They're also naming you personally. The order was filed at midnight. We have an emergency hearing in federal court in 4 hours." She said, "On what grounds?" He said, "Securities fraud. They're alleging systematic manipulation of the fund's performance reporting over a period of 4 years." She was quiet for a moment. She had been running Liang Capital for 23 years. The fund had $4.2 billion in assets under management. Its performance record was, by the standard metrics of the industry, exceptional. She had not manipulated a single reporting figure in 23 years of operation. She said, "The evidence," he said, "the SEC is claiming to have internal documents, transaction records and communications from inside the firm. Someone with access to the internal systems provided them." She said, "When can I see what they have?" He said, "I'm on my way to your building now." She ended the call. She navigated her wheelchair to the window of the apartment in the West Hills and looked at the Portland city lights distributed across the valley below in the specific way they distributed themselves before dawn, when the freeway lights and the building lights made a pattern that looked almost like the circuit board patterns she had studied in electrical engineering at MIT in 1985. When she was 22 years old and had no idea that the thing she was going to build with her life was a $30 billion investment portfolio and a reputation that was now, in the space of one phone call at 4:47 in the morning, in the process of being dismantled. She thought about who had access to the internal systems. She thought about who would have the motivation to provide documents to the SEC. She thought about the specific shape of the allegation, not the fact of it, which was false, but the architecture of it, the specific claims that would require specific evidence, and what that evidence would need to look like to be convincing. She thought about all of this with the specific calm that she had developed over 30 years of making decisions under pressure, and she began the morning regimen, and she waited for Robert Huang. If you have ever watched a life's work threatened in a single morning and found out months later that the truth was buried in a place no one had thought to look, stay until the end of this story. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. What was buried and who found it and why they looked where no one else had looked is a story about two people whose paths had no reason to cross and whose crossing changed both of their lives and the life of the company, and the specific question of whether the truth was ever findable once the people with the resources had decided they would prefer it to remain buried. Before we get to the evidence, let me tell you who these two people were. The evidence matters. The people matter more. Catherine Liang was born in 1963 in Taipei, Taiwan, the eldest daughter of an electrical engineer named Wei Lin and a secondary school mathematics teacher named Mei Hua, who had, between them, a quality that their daughter absorbed so completely it became indistinguishable from her own character: an absolute refusal to accept imprecise reasoning as a substitute for the accurate kind. Wei Lin taught his daughter to read circuit diagrams before she could read English, which she had not yet learned at 5 because the family spoke Mandarin at home and the neighborhood spoke Hokkien, and English was something that happened in school, which she did not yet attend. The circuit diagrams were, in Wei Lin's pedagogical theory, better than either language for communicating the fundamental structure of how things worked. The relationships between components, the paths available to current, the conditions under which a circuit would function correctly, and the conditions under which it would fail. He believed that a person who understood circuits understood the deep grammar of systems, and that the deep grammar of systems was the most useful intellectual tool available to someone who intended to change the world. Catherine had found this theory correct in every domain she had subsequently applied it to. The theory of how financial systems worked, how capital moved between components, what conditions produced function and what produced failure was, at its base, the same theory Wei Lin had taught her with circuit diagrams. She had understood this when she arrived at MIT in 1981 and had found in the electrical engineering program the specific vocabulary for what she had always known: that the behavior of complex systems was, at root, the behavior of the connections between their parts, and that the person who understood the connections understood the system. She had not planned to go into finance. She had planned to go into semiconductor design, where the circuit theory was most directly applicable and where, in the early 1980s, the most interesting problems were being worked on by the people who would define the next 30 years of the industry. She had interned at Intel in 1985 and had been, by any assessment, exceptionally good at it. She had also been, by her own assessment, insufficiently interested in the specific problem of making existing chip architectures faster and smaller. She was more interested in the problem of how systems allocated resources under uncertainty, which was a problem that was at the center of semiconductor design and also at the center of financial markets, and at the center of most of the genuinely interesting problems she could identify. She had met David Park at MIT in 1984 in a mathematics seminar on stochastic systems that she had taken because it was the most technically demanding elective available, and he had taken for the same reason. David was studying economics. He was 3 years older and had the quality of genuine intellectual humility that Catherine found in a graduate program full of very intelligent people who were not always humble about the intelligence, genuinely distinctive. He did not pretend to understand things he did not understand, which was rarer than it should have been. They had married in 1988. David had gone into the policy world, a career in regulatory economics that had taken him to the Federal Reserve and then to the SEC and eventually to a senior position in the Office of Financial Research, which was where he had been when the accident happened. The accident had been in 2014 when Catherine was 51 on Interstate 84 in Oregon, the same stretch of highway where she had driven 100 times. A driver who had been awake for 22 hours had crossed the center line. She had been in the passenger seat. The spinal cord injury at T5 had been complete. She had been in a wheelchair since November of that year. David had died in the accident. He had been driving. She had spent the year following the accident in the specific and terrible work of being someone who has lost the person at the center of their life and simultaneously acquired a changed physical reality, and who does not have the option of addressing either of these fully because the other requires immediate management. She had done what her character required. She had managed both. Not well, she could be honest about this in retrospect, that the year of 2015 had been the worst work she had ever done at anything, imprecise and insufficient in ways she could identify clearly, but functional. She had kept Liang Capital running. She had kept herself alive and moving through the days in the specific practical way that the days required, because stopping was not an option she was willing to take, and because the alternative to continuing was the alternative she had decided against. By 2016, she was working at full capacity from the wheelchair, with the specific organizational adaptation that the wheelchair required, the office layout, the travel protocols, the specific management of accessibility that had become, over time, a background process rather than a foreground one. She had kept David present in her work in the specific way that was available. She named the fund's scholarship program after him, and she reviewed the regulatory philosophy he had developed over 20 years with the specific attention of someone who was maintaining an intellectual inheritance. And she ran Liang Capital with the same rigor she had always brought to it, and with the additional clarity that loss produced when you were honest with what it cost you. By 2023, the year of the 447 phone call, she had been running Liang Capital for 23 years, since she was 40 years old, since the fund's founding assets of $280 million had been contributed by a small group of institutional investors who had believed, on the basis of her track record at the quantitative hedge fund where she had developed her investment methodology, that her approach to risk-adjusted return was sound. The track record had proved to be sound. The fund had grown steadily and without the dramatic performance peaks and crashes that characterized many hedge funds, from $280 million to $4.2 billion. It had 17 employees and 2 offices, Portland and New York, and a reputation in the institutional investment community for transparency and consistency that Catherine had worked as deliberately to cultivate as she had worked to cultivate the performance record, because she understood that the two were connected. The performance was the product of an accurate analysis of market conditions, and the transparency was the product of the same disposition toward accuracy applied to the communication of that analysis to investors. She had never manipulated a performance report. She had never had a reason to. The actual performance was good. She had also never been betrayed by someone inside her organization. She had had employees leave, disagreements with analysts about methodology, the ordinary friction of a professional organization maintained over 2 decades. She had not had someone with access to her internal systems provide fabricated documents to the federal securities regulator. She had 4 hours before the hearing. She waited for Robert Huang. She completed the morning regimen. She thought about circuits and the path that current would take when a component failed, and where in the system of Liang Capital the failure had been introduced. The specific architecture of Liang Capital's investment methodology was, in the industry vocabulary, a quantitative macro strategy, a systematic approach to identifying mispricings in global fixed income and currency markets. executed through a proprietary model that Catherine had developed iteratively over the 10 years between her first investment role in 1990 and the founding of the fund in 2000. The model was not secret. Its general logic was available to anyone who read the firm's offering documents, but its specific implementation was the product of thousands of hours of development and testing that produced a system that was genuinely differentiated from the approaches used by comparable funds. What differentiated it was not the sophistication of the quantitative techniques, which were sophisticated but not unique. What differentiated it was the specific criterion Catherine applied to model development. The model was not complete until she could explain in plain language why each signal produced the behavior it produced. She did not accept black box outputs. If the model produced a signal that the quantitative analysis supported but that she could not explain in causal terms, she did not trade on the signal until she understood the cause. This slowed the model's development significantly relative to funds that were willing to trade on empirically validated signals without causal understanding. It also produced a model that was, in crisis conditions, more stable than most, because Catherine understood why it was behaving as it was even when market conditions were unusual. David had been the first to formalize this quality of her approach in regulatory terms. He had told her early in the fund's history that what she was building was not only a good investment methodology, but a good regulatory posture. The causal explanation requirement meant that the fund's strategies were always explainable to a regulator who asked the right questions, because the fund's managers understood why the strategies worked rather than simply that they worked. This explainability was, in the regulatory environment of the early 2000s, neither required nor rewarded. It was in the regulatory environment of 2023, when the SEC was examining the fund's performance record, the specific quality of the record that made the fabricated version identifiable as fabricated. The fabrication had been built from Thornton's knowledge of the model and the reporting systems. Thornton had understood the quantitative techniques. He had not understood the causal reasoning that underlay the signals, because Catherine had kept that reasoning in her own domain rather than fully distributing it through the analytical team. He had built the fabricated performance figures by applying the quantitative logic without the causal constraints. The result was internally consistent at the level of the numbers and subtly inconsistent at the level of the causal mechanisms. A building whose structure added up correctly and whose load distribution was wrong in specific places that only someone who understood the underlying physics would detect. Marcus had not detected this specific inconsistency in the first review. He had not needed to, because the metadata analysis had been sufficient to demonstrate the fabrication. But when Robert's forensics team had subsequently done the causal analysis, comparing the trade sequence in the fabricated reporting documents against the causal logic of the strategy as documented in the fund's regulatory filings, the inconsistencies had been present and had been cited in the evidentiary memorandum as additional evidence of fabrication. This was what David would have found. Not only was the record fabricated, but the fabricator had not understood what he was fabricating well enough to fabricate it correctly. The causal architecture of the fund's strategy was the one element of the performance record that Thornton's access to the firm had not given him fully. It had been, for 23 years, the one thing Catherine had kept as her own. This was not strategic. It was simply who she was, the person who needed to understand why before she trusted the output. She had kept the causal reasoning in her own domain because it was hers, the specific product of Wei Lin's circuit diagrams and MIT and 30 years of genuine intellectual engagement with the question of why markets behaved as they did. She had not been protecting it. She had simply never needed to hand it off because she was still the one who ran the model. The causal architecture had been the evidence that survived everything. The rest of the evidence had been found by Marcus. The causal architecture had been built by her across 30 years without knowing it would someday be the one element of her life's work that a sophisticated fabrication could not replicate. The authentic thing again, always the authentic thing. There was also something specific about Catherine's experience of the post-injury years that was relevant to understanding how she had received the investigation and what it had meant to her. The specific relationship between physical limitation and institutional trust that the wheelchair had produced in her professional life. She had found, in the 4 years between the injury and the fraud investigation, that the wheelchair changed the texture of professional interactions in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes not, and that the useful changes were the ones she had not expected. The expected changes, the accessibility adjustments, the physical logistics, the management of other people's responses to the visible disability, were real but manageable and had become, by 2023, sufficiently routinized to require less active management than they had in 2015. The unexpected change was more significant. The wheelchair had modified, in ways she had not anticipated, the specific quality of trust that people extended to her in professional settings. Not the trust in her intelligence or her professional judgment, which had not changed. The trust in her intentions. She had found over the 4 years that a segment of the professional world she worked in extended to her, with the wheelchair visible, a slightly more complete form of the trust they had always nominally given her, but had modulated in the specific way that people modulated their trust of a competitor of comparable capability. They had trusted her professionally while maintaining the competitive assumption that she was operating strategically rather than honestly. The wheelchair, for reasons she had thought about carefully without arriving at a complete explanation, reduced this modulation in some fraction of the people she worked with. They saw her more fully as she was rather than as a strategic actor managing her presentation, and the seeing was, for the fraction of people capable of it, the foundation of a different quality of engagement. She had not sought this. She had not performed vulnerability to produce it. She had simply been who she was in the circumstances she was in, and some people had responded to the full person rather than the professional persona that the full person sat behind in most institutional contexts. David would have found this analytically interesting, the specific mechanism by which visible physical vulnerability in a professional context reduced the strategic filtering that normally governed professional trust. She found it practically useful and theoretically interesting in equal measure. Marcus Webb had been, from the first meeting, someone who did not appear to be doing the strategic filtering. He had been in her apartment for 2 hours on a Thursday evening as a professional contact she had never previously met, and he had asked a question that was more useful than anything Robert's team had produced in 8 hours, and he had done it without apparent awareness that this was remarkable, which was itself a form of the not filtering. The specific quality of someone who was simply operating from his best assessment of what the situation required without managing the assessment for the impression it would make on the person receiving it. She had noticed this. She had noted it as a data point in the ongoing assessment that she conducted of everyone she worked with. The data point had accumulated over the days and months into the pattern that the October conversation had named. The pattern was real. The naming had been accurate. She was comfortable with accuracy always. Marcus Webb was born in 1985 in Northeast Portland, the younger of two sons of a woman named Gloria who had worked the reference desk at the Multnomah County Library on N.E. Deckham Street for 26 years. Gloria Webb was not famous. She was in the specific way that certain people are specifically valuable to the communities they serve without being recognized for it, essential. She knew the collection the way a good carpenter knew a workshop, and she knew the people who came in the way a good physician knew their patients, by the specific shape of what they needed and the specific gap between what they asked for and what would actually help them. Marcus had grown up in that library. Not literally, though there were stretches of his childhood when the after-school hours were spent at the table near the periodicals where Gloria could keep an eye on him while serving patrons, which had the specific educational effect of immersing him in the ambient practice of research. The persistent, organized, specific search for information that was actually true. He had absorbed this without knowing he was absorbing it, in the way that the most important educations happen, through the consistent proximity to someone who was doing the right work in the right way. His father was not in the picture beyond the earliest years, which Marcus had managed the way children manage foundational absences, by accepting the absence as a fact of the landscape and organizing his life around what was actually present rather than what was theoretically missing. What was actually present was Gloria, who was methodical and direct and who had the quality of telling him the true thing even when the true thing was harder than the managed version. She had said when he was 12 and asked why his father had not stayed, "I don't know exactly and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I know is that you are here and I am here and what we make of that is our business and nobody else's." He had thought about this for years. He had concluded she was right. He had gone to Portland State for 2 years and had left without a degree. Not from failure, but from the specific impatience of someone who had identified what they wanted to do before the institution had got around to teaching it. He had been working in the summers for a small private investigation firm owned by a man named Harold Stein, who had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant before pivoting into investigative work, and who had taken Marcus on at 19 because Marcus had shown up at his office door asking for work after reading about a case Harold had solved that had been written up in the Oregonian, and had said, "I want to learn how you find things that people don't want to be found." Harold had said, "Most people who want to do this work think it's about surveillance." He said, "It isn't, it's about documents. It's about following the paper trail until you get to the place where someone has tried to erase the paper and understanding the specific shape of the erasure." Marcus had said, "That sounds like what my mother does at the library." Harold had looked at him. He had said, "Sit down." Harold had trained him for 3 years, alongside the Portland State coursework, and Marcus had eventually recognized that the Portland State coursework was less valuable to him than the training, and had made the choice to concentrate on the training. He had worked for Harold's firm for 7 years, becoming the person Harold sent on the most technically complex cases. The forensic document analysis, the financial record reconstruction, the cases where someone had tried to make something disappear and Marcus had to find where it had gone. He had met his wife, Amara, in 2013 at a bar in the Pearl District, where a mutual friend had organized a birthday gathering that Marcus had almost not attended because he had been in the middle of a financial records reconstruction that was consuming most of his attention. Amara was a graphic designer with the specific quality of patience that people who work with visual complexity develop, the ability to sit with ambiguity until the pattern resolved. They had recognized in each other, without naming it, the same fundamental orientation to difficult problems. You did not manage the difficulty away, you sat with it until it yielded. They had married in 2015. Their daughter Zara was born in 2016 and had from the first weeks of her life her mother's quality of patience and her father's quality of persistence, which was a combination that Marcus found, watching her grow, simultaneously familiar and specifically her own. Amara had died in 2020 of the aggressive, rapid form of ovarian cancer that did not announce itself until it was advanced, which was the specific cruelty of it. The diagnosis arrived in July and Amara was gone by October, and the 3 months between had the quality of time that does not have an adequate description, that Marcus had stopped trying to describe to people who had not been inside it. Zara was 4 when Amara died. She was 7 in 2023, the year of the 447 phone call and what followed it. Marcus had, in the 3 years since Amara's death, continued the investigative work because it was the work he knew and because it provided what a single parent with a 7-year-old needed. Flexible hours, variable schedule, the ability to be present at school pickup and school events by structuring the investigative work around the hours Zara was in school and the evenings after she was in bed. He had left Harold's firm in 2021, not from disagreement but from the practical calculation that an independent practice gave him more schedule flexibility. And Harold had understood this and had continued to send him cases when the caseload exceeded what Harold's firm could manage. The referral arrangement was the foundation of his independent practice's client base. He lived in the house in Beaumont, Wilshire that he and Amara had bought in 2018, which had the specific quality of being the right size for 3 people and the slightly different quality of being the right size for 2, which was a distinction that had taken him a year to stop noticing and another year to accept as a fact of the landscape rather than a wound that required management. He had done what he had watched Gloria do, organized his life around what was actually present rather than what was theoretically missing. What was actually present was Zara, and the work, and the specific discipline of finding things that people did not want to be found, which was the work he was best at and which arrived in October of 2023 in the specific form of a case he had not expected, and that produced outcomes that neither he nor Catherine Liang could have anticipated on the afternoon he arrived at her office. The specific quality Marcus had developed through his years with Harold, the ability to find what people wanted to remain unfound, was not, in his own characterization of it, a special talent. It was a practiced discipline, built on a simple and replicable foundation, the willingness to look at the relationships between things rather than the things themselves. Harold had said this the first week, and Marcus had applied it consistently for 9 years, and the application had produced results that people sometimes mistook for intuition when they were. In fact, the accumulated product of a methodology applied carefully enough that the results sometimes arrived faster than the observer could track the steps. He had also developed, through the years of investigative work, a specific sensitivity to the shape of erasure, the distinctive pattern that information left when someone had tried to remove it from a system. Erasure was never complete. Erasure of digital information was, in particular, always partial. The primary record might be gone, but the access log, the network traffic record, the backup system that had captured a snapshot before the deletion, the residual metadata in the systems the deleted file had touched, these persisted. The shape of the erasure was itself information, often more specific than the original record would have been, because the specific choices made in the erasure revealed the eraser's knowledge of the system and therefore their identity, their access level, and the nature of what they had been trying to conceal. This understanding had been the core of his best work for Harold, and it was the understanding that he had applied on the first night of the Liang Capital investigation. He had looked not for what was missing from the access log, but for what the specific form of the modification to the access log revealed about who had performed it and how. The operation type field had been modified, but the database engine signature had not been removed, because removing the signature required access to the database engine's internal tables rather than the user interface, and the person who had performed the modification had not known this. The gap in knowledge was the evidence. The shape of the erasure revealed the eraser's limits. Harold had told him in the training years that the most useful thing you could know about a person who was hiding something was what they did not know about the system they were hiding it in. People hid things using the tools they understood. The gaps in their hiding revealed the edges of their understanding. If you mapped the gaps, you had a profile of the person, and the profile led you to them as surely as a direct identification would have. Marcus had mapped the gaps in the Liang Capital erasure. They had led him to James Chen, and to the intersection of James Chen's capabilities and James Thornton's domain knowledge, and to the full shape of the scheme. He had been thinking in the months since the investigation about what Harold's framework said about the larger pattern of the case, not the specific technical pattern but the human one. Thornton and Chen had hidden something. The shape of the hiding had revealed them. Catherine had built something authentic. The authenticity had survived the attempt to replace it with a fabricated version. Marcus had found the authentic thing by understanding its shape before looking for it, which he had been able to do because Catherine had described it to him accurately in the first meeting. The chain ran, Catherine's accuracy to Marcus's question to the evidence to the dismissal. Every link in the chain was a form of the same quality, the willingness to be accurate about what was actually there rather than what was more convenient to assert. This was, he thought, the most compact description available of the difference between the honest work and the dishonest version. The honest work followed the evidence to what was actually true. The dishonest work manufactured evidence in the direction of what was convenient to be true. The manufactured version was always vulnerable to the encounter with the authentic thing because the authentic thing was more coherent, more consistent, more specific than any fabrication could be. You could not manufacture the full complexity of something real. The complexity of the real thing was always more than the complexity of the made thing. He had explained this to Zara at some point in the winter in the terms available to a 7-year-old. The fake thing was always simpler than the real thing because you could only make something as complicated as you understood and you never fully understood the real thing. She had said, that's why fakes always get found out. He had said, not always. He had said, but eventually. She had said, that's good. He had said, yes. Zara had, in the year since the Liang Capital investigation, developed an interest in what her father did that was different in quality from the interest she had expressed when she was younger. When she was 5 or 6, her interest had been in the dramatic surface, the bad people, the hiding of things, the finding. Now at 7 going on 8, her interest was in the mechanism, the specific way of thinking that produced the finding. She had asked him in the spring following the investigation whether all investigations work the same way. He had said, what do you mean by the same way? She had said, do you always start with the relationship? He had looked at her. She had said, you told me the interesting part was between the beginning and the end, and you told me the evidence was in the relationship between the two kinds of documents. She said, is that always where you look? He had thought about this. He had said, yes. He had said the relationship is almost always where the evidence is. She had said, why doesn't everyone know that? He had said, most people find it more natural to look at the things themselves rather than what's between them. She had said, but the things themselves are just the surface. He had said, yes. She had said, the relationship is what's actually there. He had said, that's exactly right. She had gone back to the drawing she had been working on, a map of the neighborhood, with lines connecting the places she considered important, annotated in her specific careful handwriting with notes about why the connections mattered. He had looked at the map. He had said, what is this? She had said, I'm mapping the relationships. She had said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had absorbed a principle and was applying it. He had thought, yes, that's exactly what to do. He had thought about Amara, who had said the interesting part was in the middle. He had thought about Gloria, who had built a reference collection for 26 years and who had known where everything was because she understood the system it sat in. He had thought about Harold, who had said to follow the paper trail to the shape of the erasure. He had thought about Catherine, who had said the authentic thing was what she had always had. He had thought all of these people were saying the same thing. The thing itself was less important than what it was connected to and what it was part of. The system was the thing. The relationships were the evidence. You found what you were looking for by understanding the system it existed in. He was in a system. The system was developing. He was paying attention to the relationships. He intended to keep paying attention. The hearing had gone as poorly as Robert had expected and as well as Catherine had prepared for under the circumstances. The SEC's position was presented by a lead attorney named Douglas Mercer, who had the specific quality of a federal prosecutor who believed completely in his case, which was either the sign of a genuinely strong case or the sign of someone who had been given manufactured evidence that was sufficiently well made to produce complete belief. Robert had argued for dismissal on the grounds of insufficient evidence for the restraining order. The judge had denied the dismissal and had extended the restraining order for 60 days pending a full evidentiary hearing. Liang Capital was frozen. The fund's trading was suspended. The investors had been notified. Catherine had sat through the hearing with the specific composure of someone who had decided, before arriving, that composure was a strategic necessity rather than an emotional achievement. She had held it for 4 hours. She had held it in the car on the way back to the office and in the elevator up to the 17th floor and through the 30-minute conversation with her senior partners, who were professional people in a professional crisis, and who were handling it professionally except for the specific quality of their eyes, which were the eyes of people who were managing their assessment of whether they believed her. She did not hold it alone afterward at her desk, which was when the composure was no longer serving a strategic purpose and could be set down. She picked it up again 20 minutes later. She looked at the internal access logs that her IT director, Kevin Lee, had pulled overnight. Someone with credentials belonging to her former head of quantitative analysis, James Thornton, who had left the firm in August, had accessed the firm's data archive in the week before the SEC filing. The access had been from an IP address that resolved to a hotel in Seattle. James Thornton had not left the firm on amicable terms. He had been terminated for a pattern of performance issues that Catherine had documented over 8 months before the termination, and he had threatened, in the exit interview, to pursue various legal remedies that his attorney had subsequently confirmed were not viable. He had been quiet since August. She had attributed the quiet to the usual post-termination management of a situation that had been handled correctly. The quiet had not been quiescence. It had been preparation. This was the hypothesis. Hypotheses required evidence. The evidence that had been filed with the SEC was, in Catherine's assessment, a sophisticated fabrication. The documents had the correct formatting, the correct metadata structure, and the content of genuine Liang Capital records with specific figures altered in ways that produced, across a 4-year period, the pattern of performance manipulation that the SEC was alleging. Whoever had created the fabrication had understood the firm's reporting systems in detail, had known what authentic documents looked like, and had made the alterations with enough sophistication to pass the initial review of experienced federal securities attorneys. This level of sophistication required specific capabilities. James Thornton had the domain knowledge, the reporting systems, the document architecture. He did not have, in Catherine's assessment, the specific technical capability to produce the forgeries without help. The help was the question. The help was where the evidence would be. Robert Huang's firm had a financial forensics team that was excellent. They had been on the fabricated documents since morning and had identified, by late afternoon, 3 specific anomalies in the document metadata that were inconsistent with the documents having originated from Liang Capital systems. This was significant but not sufficient. The metadata anomalies proved the documents had been altered, not who had altered them or how to find the original versions. The original versions were critical. If the authentic versions of the documents could be located and produced, the actual transaction records and communications from the period in question, they would directly contradict the fabricated versions, and the contradiction would be specific and demonstrable and would collapse the SEC's case from the inside. The authentic versions were somewhere. They always were, in the specific way that digital information was preserved even when people believed they had erased it. In backup systems, in archive logs, in the specific residue that information left when it moved through a system. Finding them required someone who understood both the technical structure of how the residue existed and the investigative methodology for surfacing it from the environments where it had come to rest. Robert had a financial forensics team. The financial forensics team had a referral network. The referral network included, by the specific coincidence of a case, Harold Stein had worked for Robert's firm in 2021 and the professional relationship that had produced a name, Marcus Webb. Robert called Harold, Harold called Marcus. Marcus called Robert at 4 in the afternoon, 5 hours before he would have been at Zara's school for pickup. He said, "Tell me what you have." Robert told him. Marcus listened. He asked 5 questions, each of which was, in Robert's assessment, precisely the right question for someone who was orienting to a problem he had not yet seen the full shape of. He said, "I'd like to meet with Ms. Liang directly. Tonight if possible," he said. "There's a specific question I need to ask her that isn't in what you've told me, and the answer is going to determine where I start looking." Robert called Catherine. She said, "Send him at 7. Marcus picked up Zara from after-school care. He made dinner, he explained, in the terms available to a 7-year-old who was accustomed to her father doing interesting work at unusual hours, that he had a meeting with someone who needed help finding something important. Zara said, "What did she lose?" He said, "Someone took something from her and made it look like something else." Zara said, "Like a swap." He said, "Exactly like a swap." She said, "That's mean." He said, "Yes." She said, "You'll find it." He said, "I hope so." His mother, Gloria, came over at 6:30 to stay with Zara. He drove to the address Robert had given him, a building in the West Hills, residential, not the Liang Capital office. He had expected the office. The residential address meant she was receiving him at home, which was a different kind of trust, the trust of someone who had decided that the normal professional distance was less important than the need to have this conversation immediately and completely. He had taken exactly 3 things to the meeting: his laptop, a notebook, and the specific question that he needed Catherine Liang to answer before he could determine where the missing evidence was most likely to be found. The 8 days between the 4:47 call and the filing of the motion to dismiss were, in Catherine's retrospective account of them, among the most concentrated of her professional life. Not in the sense of demanding the most from her, which had happened many times in 23 years, but in the sense of requiring the most precise management of the gap between what was visible externally and what she knew internally. Externally, Liang Capital was frozen. The trading was suspended. The fund's 17 employees, the investment analysts, the quantitative researchers, the operational staff, had been told what had happened in a meeting Catherine had held the morning after the hearing, With the specific directness she brought to all information that people needed to receive accurately and completely. She had told them, "This is what was filed, this is what it alleges, this is why the allegation is false, and this is what we are doing about it." She had answered every question directly. She had not managed the information toward a version that was easier to receive. She had given them the accurate version, which was the version that would allow them to do their jobs over the next 8 days without operating on false premises. 2 of the 17 had, in the days following, asked whether they should begin looking for other positions. She had told them, "That is your judgment to make, and I will support you in making it." She had also told them, "My assessment is that the situation will be resolved within 2 weeks. I am not asking you to act on my assessment, I am giving it to you as information." Neither of them had left. This was, she had told Marcus later, the specific evidence she trusted most in the entire 8 days. The people who had been with her long enough to understand how she operated had chosen to wait. She had managed the investor communications with the same directness. The fund's 22 institutional investors had received an initial communication within 24 hours of the SEC filing, describing the action and the firm's response. She had written the communication herself, which was not the standard approach. Most fund managers use communications professionals for regulatory crisis messaging, because she did not trust the communications professional to find the specific level of precision that her investors deserved and that she was capable of providing. The communication had said, "The SEC has issued a temporary restraining order based on allegations of performance manipulation that I am contesting as false. The investigation into the basis of those allegations is underway. I will provide a full accounting when the investigation is complete. I understand that this communication may not be sufficient for all of your needs. I am available for individual conversations with any investor who requires one." 11 investors had requested individual conversations. She had all 11 over the 4 days following the initial communication. She had told each of them the same accurate thing in the same specific language without managing the message for the particular investor's known preferences or prior relationship with the firm. The accurate message was the same for everyone. That was the point. She had also, in the margins of the 8 days, in the hours when Kevin Lee had the cold storage access logs and Marcus was in the archives and Robert's team was on the fabricated documents, thought about David. She thought about him regularly, and in ways that were, by 6 years after his death, no longer the acute form of grief but the specific ongoing form of missing someone who had been the person you thought with. She thought about what he would have made of the specific nature of the attack, the use of the firm's own authentic records as the mechanism of a fabricated fraud allegation. He would have found this analytically interesting in the way that a regulatory economist found certain failure modes analytically interesting, as evidence of a specific gap in the system's defenses, a gap that was only visible once the gap had been exploited. He would also, she thought, have been furious, in the specific controlled way that he was furious when institutions that were supposed to protect honest actors were used against them. He had spent his career building regulatory frameworks precisely to prevent this kind of exploitation. He had believed, with the specific combination of rigor and hope that his career reflected, that the frameworks could be made robust enough to distinguish authentic from fabricated, to protect the honest actor from the sophisticated attack. The Thornton and Chen scheme was a demonstration of the limits of the framework, a limit that David would have wanted addressed, specifically and systemically in the way he had addressed regulatory gaps for 30 years. She had thought, "I will address it," not the full systemic gap which was beyond her individual authority, the specific gap in the firm's own security architecture which was her responsibility and which the investigation would clarify and which she would close. She had been in the 8 days angry in the precise way that genuine injustice produced anger in a person who was honest about it. Not rage, not grief, but the specific temperature of someone who has been wronged deliberately, who knows it, who is not pretending otherwise, and who is directing the temperature toward the work of correction rather than toward any other object. This was the temperature she had learned from Mei Hua, who had managed difficult students and difficult parents for 30 years as a high school principal, and who had said once when Catherine asked how she maintained her composure, "I don't maintain my composure. I direct my anger at the problem rather than at the person. It goes somewhere useful." Catherine had understood this in theory at 22, she had understood it in practice by 50. The anger was going somewhere useful. The investigation was proceeding, Marcus was in the archives, Catherine answered the door herself. She had heard the elevator arrive and had navigated to the entry, which told Marcus 2 things before either of them had spoken. She was not using the building's concierge service for the meeting, which meant she was not treating this as a standard professional intake, and she was managing the physical logistics herself with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped performing accommodation for the benefit of observers. She said, "Mr. Webb, come in." He followed her through the apartment to the room she used as a workspace, a corner room with 2 walls of windows, both facing into the city, with a desk that had been adapted for wheelchair use and a standing table beside it that was clearly for visitors who stood. He sat in the chair near the window. She positioned herself at the desk. The city lights were visible below in the specific way of the West Hills at night. She said, Robert tells me you have a question that determines where you start looking. He said yes. He said it without preamble because she was clearly not a person who valued preamble. He said the fabricated documents, the SEC is claiming they show 4 years of performance manipulation. He said the manipulation would have to be coordinated with the actual performance records to be convincing. It couldn't just be the reporting documents. It would have to be at least a partial set of the underlying transaction records too, altered to match. Otherwise, the discrepancy would be visible in the first audit. She said, correct. He said, so the question is, he leaned forward slightly, how much of the underlying transaction record did they have access to and how much did they fabricate? She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's the right question. She navigated to a second display and turned it toward him. She had pulled up the list of documents in the SEC filing. She said Robert's forensics team has identified the reporting documents as fabricated. These ones, she indicated 3/4 of the document list. She said, they haven't looked at the underlying transaction records yet because that analysis takes more time. He said, I looked at the filing on the way here. He pulled out his notebook. He said, the transaction records in the filing, pages 47 through 193, have a different structure than the reporting documents. The metadata on the reporting documents has the anomalies Robert's team found. I want to know if the metadata on the transaction records has the same anomalies or different ones. She said, why does the difference matter? He said, because if the transaction records have the same anomalies, they were fabricated by the same person using the same method, which tells me something specific about how they were made. If the anomalies are different or absent, it means the transaction records may be authentic documents that were obtained and provided to the SEC alongside the fabricated reporting documents. She was very still for a moment. She said, why would someone provide authentic transaction records alongside fabricated reporting documents? He said, because the authentic transaction records look wrong when compared to the fabricated reporting documents. The fabricated documents show inflated performance. The authentic transaction records show real performance. Someone reading the authentic transaction records against the fabricated reporting documents sees a discrepancy and concludes the reporting was manipulated. But the discrepancy is in the other direction from what the SEC is alleging. The fabricated documents show better performance than the authentic records, not worse. He said whoever constructed this chose authentic underlying records specifically because they create the appearance of a discrepancy that supports the fraud narrative when placed next to the fabricated reporting documents. She was looking at him with the specific attention of someone receiving analysis that is advancing faster than expected and that they are tracking precisely. She said, if the transaction records are authentic, where did they come from? He said, from someone who had access to the live data archive. Your former head of quant analysis had access credentials, and the access log shows those credentials used after his departure. But the live data archive, the current one, doesn't contain the transaction records from the period in question in a form that could be easily extracted. He said, your IT director confirmed this afternoon that the archive was migrated from an older system in 2022. He said the pre-migration data is in a cold storage system that requires elevated credentials. He paused, which means either someone had elevated access or the authentic transaction records were obtained before the migration. She said, before the migration. She said it with a quality of sudden attention, the way someone said something when it had just connected to something they already knew. She said, James Thornton was involved in the migration planning. He had access to the pre-migration data for the 3 months before his termination. He said, yes. He said, that's where I want to start. He said, the pre-migration cold storage archive has a complete access log. If Thornton extracted data from it, there will be a record. The record may have been partially obfuscated. There are several ways to do this, but the obfuscation itself leaves traces that are different from the traces that normal access leaves. I can work through the archive structure and find both the extraction event and the obfuscation method. She said, how long? He said, if the obfuscation is one of the 3 methods I'd expect given the sophistication of the fabrication, I can find it in 2 to 3 days. If it's something more unusual, longer. He said, I'll need complete access to the cold storage archive and the migration logs, direct access to your IT director, and I'd prefer to work from your office rather than remotely so I can ask questions when the questions arise. She said, those are straightforward requests. She said, I have one condition. He said, what is it? She said, when you find something, not if, when you bring it to me before you bring it to Robert. He said, that's not the standard workflow. She said, I know. She said, I need to understand the shape of what you found before the legal framework is applied to it, because the legal framework will determine how it's used, and I need to be the one who decides how it's used. He looked at her. She said, I have seen capable attorneys make excellent legal strategies out of evidence that was used in a way that served the legal strategy and did not serve the full truth. Robert is excellent. I trust him. I want to see the evidence first. He thought about this. He thought about the specific quality of the request, not the concealment of evidence, which would have been a different thing entirely, but the sequencing of who understood it first. He thought about whether this request was compatible with the honest investigative work he was about to do. He concluded that it was because the commitment she was asking for was not about what to do with the evidence but about who understood it first, and understanding came before legal application by definition. He said, agreed with one condition from my side. She said, name it, he said. If what I find implicates something that Robert needs to know immediately for legal reasons, something with a hearing deadline or a filing requirement, I tell him simultaneously, not after. She considered this. She said, that's reasonable, agreed. She extended her hand. He shook it. She said, Kevin Lee will have your access credentials by 8 tomorrow morning. He said, one more thing. She said, yes. He said, the question I asked, the one about the metadata on the transaction records, I'd like your forensics team to run that analysis tonight. The answer will determine whether I'm looking for one source of fabrication or two. She nodded. She pulled up her phone. She said, I'll call Robert now. She looked at him. She said, Mr. Webb. He said, yes. She said, you found the right question in 5 minutes with a document list. Robert's team has had it for 8 hours. He said they were looking at what was wrong with the documents. He said, I was looking at the relationship between the documents. She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of someone who has just had a thing said to them that connects two things they have been thinking about separately. She said, circuit diagrams. He said, I'm sorry, she said. My father used to say that understanding a system required understanding the relationships between components, not the components themselves. He said, that's exactly right. She said, yes. She had a quality in her expression that was not quite a smile but was its functional equivalent, the specific expression of someone who has found unexpectedly someone who sees the same thing they see from the same angle. She called Robert. Marcus drove home. He was at his desk at 5:30 the next morning before Zara was awake, beginning with the cold storage archive. The specific quality of Catherine's apartment workspace, the corner room, the 2 walls of windows, the adapted desk, the standing table positioned at exactly the height that allowed a visitor to use it without the specific awkwardness of furniture that has not been arranged with both parties' working needs in mind, had been, Marcus noted, the product of deliberate design. He had been in many client workspaces in 9 years of investigative work, and most of them were either designed for the client's comfort alone or, in cases where the client had a disability that required accommodation, designed in the specific way of accommodation, functional, but with the residue of the effort that accommodation required rather than the ease of something designed from the beginning for the full range of use. This workspace had been designed for the full range of use. The standing table was exactly where it needed to be. The lighting was arranged to illuminate the working surface without creating glare on the display screens. The document space on the desk was organized with the specific precision of someone who retrieved information frequently and had systems for making retrieval fast and accurate. It was, in his assessment, the workspace of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had optimized the environment for the work rather than for the appearance of doing the work. He had noted this and filed it as information. In his experience, the quality of a person's working environment said something about the quality of their thinking. People who optimized for appearance rather than function tended to think in ways that optimized for appearance rather than function, and the inverse was also generally true. The workspace confirmed the assessment he had formed from Robert's description and from the evidentiary filing. This was someone who cared about what was actually there. His question about the metadata had been the direct product of this assessment. He had asked it because he had decided, in the 4 hours between Robert's call and arriving at Catherine's apartment, that the investigation should begin from the assumption that everything about the case could be understood as a system, a collection of components in specific relationships, where the system's condition was legible in the relationships rather than in any individual component. This was Harold's principle, and it was his mother's principle, and it was Catherine's father's principle, and it was, he had come to believe, the only principle that was consistently reliable for finding things that had been specifically hidden. He had read the SEC filing in the car on the way to the meeting. He had read it as a system. The system had 2 categories of components, the fabricated reporting documents and the authentic transaction records. The metadata question was the system question. What was the relationship between these 2 categories of components, and what did the relationship tell him about the system's condition? The answer had been immediate once the metadata analysis confirmed it. One category was authentic and one was fabricated. The fabrication had required authentic material to be convincing. The authentic material had been obtained through a specific technical process that would have left traces in the archive system. The traces were the evidence. He had arrived at the apartment with one question and had left with a search plan. This was the standard arc of the first meeting in any investigation he had done for Harold or subsequently for his own clients. The first meeting was not for the client to brief the investigator. It was for the investigator to find the question that would shape the search. The client brief was input. The question was what the investigator produced from the input, and the quality of the question determined the quality of the search. His quality of listening, which several clients had commented on over the years, and which he had never been fully comfortable receiving as a compliment because it seemed to him the obvious minimum requirement of the work was in the service of finding the question. You listened until you heard the thing that didn't fit, the gap, the element that was present or absent in a way that was inconsistent with the story being told. The thing that didn't fit was the question. In the Liang Capital case, the thing that didn't fit had been the mix of authentic and fabricated material. A purely fabricated document set would have been internally consistent. A mixed set fabricated reporting documents, authentic transaction records, suggested a scheme that required both, which suggested a reason for both, which suggested the extraction event. He had found the extraction event. The question had led to the evidence. The evidence had led to the dismissal. This was, he thought, not special. It was simply the work done correctly with the right question at the beginning, which was the only thing that mattered at the beginning. The cold storage archive was, in the specific way of enterprise data systems that had been built incrementally over 15 years and migrated under time pressure, a technically coherent but organizationally complex structure. Kevin Lee had given Marcus full documentation of the archive's architecture, the migration process, and the access log format, and Marcus had spent the first hour of the morning reading the documentation with the thoroughness he brought to all foundational material, not to find the answer immediately, but to understand the landscape well enough that when the answer was there, he would recognize it. The architecture told him several things. The pre-migration cold storage had been built on a database platform that generated access logs in a specific format, with timestamp, credential identifier, operation type, and data object identifier. The format had one known obfuscation vulnerability. The operation type field could be modified after the fact by anyone with database administrator credentials, which would change the visible record of what had been done during an access event without changing the timestamp or the credential identifier. This was the most common obfuscation method for the kind of data extraction Marcus was expecting, and it was the first thing he looked for. He looked for it by examining the distribution of operation types across all access events in the log. In a normal archive access log, the operation types appeared in a specific distribution, mostly read operations, a small percentage of administrative operations, and a very small number of bulk export operations. Bulk export operations were logged differently from read operations. They produced a distinctive signature in the log's internal structure that was visible even if the operation type field had been modified, because the signature was generated at the database engine level and was not modifiable through the same interface as the operation type field. He found the bulk export signature at 11:43 p.m. on September 14th, 3 weeks before the SEC filing. The credential identifier was James Thornton's. The data objects accessed during the bulk export included the complete transaction record set for fiscal years 2019 through 2022, exactly the period covered by the SEC's fraud allegation. The operation type field for the event had been modified to read routine archive verification, which was the specific type of administrative operation that occurred every quarter as part of the standard data governance process, and that a superficial review would have passed without attention. The modification had been made using database administrator credentials at 11:52 p.m. on the same night, 9 minutes after the bulk export. Marcus checked the administrator credential identifier. It was a service account, not a personal account, a system-level credential that was used for automated maintenance operations and that would not have been issued to James Thornton. Either Thornton had obtained the service account credentials through some other means, or someone with legitimate access to the service account had made the modification on his behalf. He called Kevin Lee at 7:30. He explained what he had found and what he needed to know about the service account. Kevin was quiet for a moment. He said, "That service account, the one used for the modification, I have to check something." He put Marcus on hold for 4 minutes. When he came back, his voice had a quality it had not had at the beginning of the call. He said, "That service account has been shared among 3 people for administrative maintenance purposes." He gave Marcus the 3 names. 2 of the names were people who had been with Liang Capital for more than 10 years and whose access patterns in the log showed no anomalies. The 3rd name was James Chen, who had been the firm's senior IT manager and who had left the firm in September, 6 weeks after James Thornton's termination and 6 weeks before the SEC filing. Marcus said, "Tell me about James Chen's departure." Kevin said it was voluntary. He said he had an opportunity at a startup. He gave 2 weeks' notice. It seemed clean, Marcus said. Did he have any relationship with Thornton? There was a pause. Kevin said they played on the firm's recreational softball team together. He said, "I don't know if that's relevant." Marcus said, "It's a data point." He said, "Pull the complete access log for the service account for the 6 weeks between Thornton's termination and Chen's resignation." He said, "I want to see everything that service account touched." The service account log for those 6 weeks contained 47 entries. 43 of them were routine automated maintenance operations, with the correct system-generated timestamps and the correct operation signatures. 4 of them were manual operations, not automated, but executed through the service account's credentials using the manual interface, occurring between September 11th and September 14th. The 4 manual operations accessed the pre-migration cold storage in a specific sequence that Marcus recognized as the preparation phase for a bulk export. Index refresh, temporary table creation, permission elevation, and then the export event itself on September 14th. The service account credentials had been used in a specific way. 4 manual operations over 3 days, followed by the bulk export, followed by the modification of the log entry. This was not the pattern of an automated system. This was the pattern of a person who had practiced the sequence before executing it, who understood exactly what needed to happen in what order to extract the data and modify the record, and who had the technical capability to do it without leaving the most obvious traces. James Chen had the technical capability. James Chen had resigned 6 weeks after Thornton's termination and 6 weeks before the SEC filing. James Chen had played on the same softball team as James Thornton. Marcus called Catherine at 8:15. He said, "I have the extraction event. It's Thornton and Chen working together." He walked her through the sequence. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Chen," she said it with the specific quality of a person placing a name in a context where it had not previously appeared. She said, "He was quiet and competent and I never had a concern about him." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's the profile, isn't it?" He said, "Yes." "The people who do this well are never the ones who gave you concerns." She said, "Yes." She said, "The transaction records he extracted, those were the authentic records that appear in the SEC filing." He said, "Yes," she said, "and the fabricated reporting documents were created separately by Thornton using his knowledge of the reporting system." He said, "Yes." He said, "Robert's forensics team confirmed last night that the metadata on the transaction records in the SEC filing is authentic Liang Capital metadata, different from the fabricated reporting documents. The transaction records are real. They were extracted legitimately and provided to create the appearance of a discrepancy with the fabricated reporting." She said, "How do I prove the reporting documents are fabricated and the authentic reporting documents show performance consistent with the transaction records?" He said, "That's the next step." He said, "The authentic reporting documents exist. They exist in the primary production archive, not the cold storage, and they have not been touched." Thornton and Chen didn't access the primary archive because the primary archive has enhanced monitoring that would have triggered an alert. He said, "The authentic reporting documents will show performance consistent with the authentic transaction records. When your forensics team compares the two, the fabrication will be visible not as a metadata anomaly, but as a direct numerical contradiction." She said, "Go," he went. The cold storage archive had, in its architecture, a specific vulnerability that James Chen had exploited, and that Marcus had known to look for because it was among the most common vulnerabilities in enterprise archive systems built on the platform Liang Capital had used. The vulnerability was not a bug. It was a design decision that had been made for operational reasons, and that had a security implication that the system's architects had considered acceptable given the intended use case of the system. The intended use case was read-only access to archived data by authorized users for audit and compliance purposes. For this use case, the design worked correctly. Users with the appropriate credentials could access the archived data, and the access was logged. The vulnerability was in the logging. The operation type field in the log was writable by users with database administrator credentials, which were necessary for routine maintenance operations, and which had been granted to the service account that Chen had been able to access. The design decision had been that database administrators needed to be able to modify log entries as part of maintenance and correction operations, correcting erroneous log entries, managing log storage space, and so forth. These were legitimate operational needs. The decision to make the log field writable for these purposes had a cost. It meant that the log could be modified by anyone with database administrator credentials, for any purpose, including obfuscation of unauthorized access. Chen had known about this vulnerability because he had been the person who designed the cold storage archive's maintenance procedures. His knowledge of the system's design was precisely what made him valuable to Thornton's scheme, and precisely what had left the specific obfuscation signature that Marcus had found. Chen had known what could be obfuscated and had obfuscated it. He had not known what could not be obfuscated: the database engine signature that was generated below the level of the user interface, and that persisted even after the operation type field had been modified. This was Harold's principle again. The gaps in the hiding revealed the edges of the hider's knowledge. Chen's knowledge of the system extended to the user interface layer. His knowledge did not extend to the database engine layer. The gap was visible in the specific incompleteness of the obfuscation, and the incompleteness was the evidence. Kevin Lee had, in the weeks following the dismissal, implemented a security architecture revision that addressed the vulnerability. The operation type field in the archive log was now write protected for all users, including database administrators. with modifications requiring a separate approval workflow and independent audit trail. The revision also included automated alerting for bulk export operations from the cold storage archive, which would have detected the September 14th event in real time rather than in retrospect. These were the correct remediation steps. They were also, as Marcus had observed to Catherine, necessary but not sufficient for the broader security question. The vulnerability that Thornton and Chen had exploited was not a technical vulnerability. It was a human vulnerability, the specific risk created by the combination of a disgruntled former employee with domain knowledge and a current employee with technical access who had a relationship with the former employee. Technical security measures addressed the technical surface. They did not address the human surface. Catherine had said, the human surface is the harder problem. He had said, yes, she had said, the technical surface is at least fully characterizable. You can enumerate the access points, the vulnerabilities, the attack vectors. The human surface is not fully characterizable because you can't enumerate all of the relationships and motivations and discontents that produce the human element of the attack. He said, correct. She said, so how do you address it? He said, partially. He said, you build a culture where the cost of participation in something like this is experienced as too high, where the professional identity that people have built in the organization is something they're not willing to sacrifice because the organization is genuinely worth being part of. He paused. The culture doesn't prevent the attack if the person has already decided to leave, but it reduces the population of people who would consider it in the first place. She had been quiet for a moment. She said, that's what I've been building for 23 years. He said, I know. She said, it failed. He said, it produced a pool of 17 people who stayed through the freeze and an investor base that increased their commitments after the disclosure. He said, that's not failure. She said, Chen participated. He said, yes. He said, no culture achieves perfect containment. The question is whether the culture is worth building anyway and whether the answer changes when a single case fails. She was quiet. She said no. He said no. She said, the culture is still worth building. He said yes. The next phase of the investigation took 4 days, which was fast by any standard for the complexity of what was being verified. Marcus worked from Liang Capital's offices. In a conference room Kevin Lee had cleared for him with direct network access to the production archive and the forensics team's work environment. He worked from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with a break at 2:30 to call Zara at after-school care, which was the specific daily touchpoint he had maintained since Amara died. Not because Zara required it, but because he required it, the specific verification that she was present and fine, which he had come to understand as one of the things that made the rest of the day possible. The work was methodical and specific, and in its core structure was the same work Gloria had done at the library reference desk for 26 years, finding the accurate record in the system where it was kept, confirming its authenticity, presenting it in the form that the person who needed it could use. The technology was different from the reference desk. The methodology was identical. The primary production archive contained the authentic reporting documents for fiscal years 2019 through 2022. They had not been accessed by unauthorized credentials. The production archive's enhanced monitoring showed a clean log, exactly as Marcus had expected. The authentic reporting documents showed performance figures that were consistent with the transaction records extracted by Thornton and Chen, with minor variations that were attributable to standard accounting timing differences. There was no discrepancy. There was no fraud. The firm had reported exactly what the transaction records showed, which was the normal performance of a competently run hedge fund. The fabricated documents that Thornton had provided to the SEC showed performance figures that were consistently higher than both the authentic reporting documents and the authentic transaction records. The fabrication had inflated the reported returns by an average of 4.2% annually across the 4-year period, enough to suggest systematic fraud to a regulator reviewing the fabricated reporting against the authentic transaction records, and designed with enough internal consistency to withstand an initial review. The fabrication had been well executed. Thornton had understood the reporting systems, had known which figures could be altered to produce the fraud narrative without creating obvious internal contradictions, and had created the altered documents with sufficient technical quality that the metadata anomalies Robert's forensics team had found were subtle rather than obvious. Without the specific examination of the relationship between the reporting documents and the transaction records, the circuit diagram approach, as Catherine had called it, the fabrication might have survived the 60-day evidentiary review. It would not survive now. Marcus had the complete evidence set. The extraction event from the cold storage archive, the service account access sequence, the comparison of authentic reporting documents against the fabricated versions, and the numerical analysis showing the discrepancy was in the fabricated documents, not the authentic performance record. He had it documented in the format that Robert's forensics team could use for the evidentiary filing, and he had it in the format that Catherine had asked for first. The clear, complete, unmediated picture of what had happened. He presented it to Catherine on the morning of the fourth day, in the workspace of her apartment. He walked through the full sequence: the extraction, the fabrication, the delivery to the SEC, the specific mechanism by which the authentic records had been weaponized against the company that had generated them. He was specific and complete and did not simplify any element of it, because Catherine Liang was someone who wanted the accurate version and for whom the accurate version was always the most useful one. She listened without interruption. She asked 4 questions, all of which were precise and all of which he answered completely. Then she was quiet for a long time, longer than her previous silences, which had been the silences of processing. This was the silence of something else, which he recognized from the 3 years he had spent in the specific country that significant loss inhabited. It was the silence of someone absorbing the full shape of what had been done to them. She said, Thornton. She said, I documented his performance issues for 8 months. I was thorough. I gave him every opportunity to correct the trajectory before the termination. She said, I treated the situation the way I would want to be treated in it. She was quiet for another moment, she said, and he spent the time building this. He said, yes. He said it simply without the managed version of the acknowledgement. She said, Chen, she said, I gave him a positive reference when he left. She said, I thought we parted well. He said, yes. She said, how long were they planning it? He said, I don't know exactly. The archive access began 3 weeks before the SEC filing. The preparation of the fabricated documents, I don't have visibility into when that began. His estimate from the sophistication of the fabrication was months rather than weeks, but he did not offer the estimate because it was not the evidence. She said, all right. She said it with the specific quality of someone who has received the full shape of the bad thing and has decided to proceed. She said, I'm going to call Robert, she said, and I want you present for that call. He said, yes. He called Zara first. She was fine. He called Gloria to arrange the evening. He sat back down in the chair by the window. Catherine called Robert. Marcus listened as she walked Robert through the evidence set with the same precision with which Marcus had walked her through it, which told him she had understood it completely and had made it her own rather than simply transmitting it. Robert asked 3 questions. He was quiet for a moment at the end. He said, Catherine, he said, this is everything we need. He said, I'm going to file the motion to dismiss this afternoon. She said, there's one more thing. She said, I want to file a separate action against Thornton and Chen, not as part of the SEC defense, separately after the dismissal with the full evidentiary record. She said, I want the record of what they did to be complete and public. Robert said, I understand. He said, the evidence supports it clearly. He said, we can do both. She ended the call. She was quiet for a moment. Marcus was quiet. The city was visible below the windows in the October afternoon light. She said, Mr. Webb? He said, yes. She said, I told you I needed to understand the shape of the evidence before the legal framework was applied to it. He said, yes. She said, what I did not know when I said that was that the shape of it would be this specific. She paused. She said, I built this company for 23 years. I ran it from this chair for 9. I reported the performance I produced. She said, the evidence you found confirms this. He said, yes. She said, I needed someone to find that evidence before I heard the legal strategy because the legal strategy should be built on the truth. He said, yes. She said, thank you. He said, yes. He drove home. He picked up Zara from his mother's apartment where Gloria had taken her after school. He made dinner. Zara said, did you find the thing? He said, yes. She said, what was it? He said, a record of something that had been hidden in a system that was supposed to be private. She said, like a secret room. He said, exactly like a secret room. She said, how did you know where to look? He said, I looked at the connections between things. He said, most secrets aren't in the places where people look for secrets. They're in the relationships between places that look ordinary. Zara thought about this. She said, that's what Mama used to say about stories. He said, what did she say? She said the interesting part was always in the middle, between the beginning and the end, where people didn't think to look. He was quiet for a moment. He said, yes, that's exactly right. The 4 days had also produced, as a byproduct of the document review, something Marcus had not expected: a granular understanding of what Liang Capital's authentic performance record actually looked like over the 4-year period in question. He had not been reading the record for investment analysis purposes. He was not an investment analyst, and the specific content of the trading strategy was not relevant to the forensic investigation. But the process of comparing the fabricated reporting documents against the authentic reporting documents had required him to examine both in sufficient detail to understand the structure of the discrepancy. And the structure of the discrepancy had given him, incidentally, a clear picture of what the fund had actually been doing. What the fund had actually been doing was, in his non-specialist assessment, completely ordinary in the best possible sense. The returns had been consistent, the risk metrics had been within the bounds documented in the offering materials, the drawdown periods had been managed in accordance with the stated strategy. There was nothing in the authentic record that suggested any manipulation or misrepresentation. The fund had done exactly what a well-run quantitative macro strategy was supposed to do. It had produced consistent, risk-adjusted returns that reflected the quality of the underlying strategy and the discipline of its execution. The fabricated documents had replaced this with a different story: higher returns with lower variance, which was the specific signature of a fund that was smoothing or inflating its performance reporting. The fabrication was not absurd. The inflated returns were within the range of what excellent funds occasionally produced, and the reduced variance was what you would expect from a fund that was selectively choosing which periods to report accurately and which to adjust. It was believable fabrication. It was, in the cold light of the authentic record beside it, false. He had sat with this for a long time on the third day. He had thought about what it meant that someone had spent months building a false version of something genuine, and that the false version was designed to look like the genuine version was not good enough, was designed to suggest that Catherine Liang had needed to inflate her returns because the authentic returns were insufficient. The authentic returns were not insufficient. They were exactly what 23 years of disciplined, accurate work produced. The fabrication had been an attempt to make the authenticity appear as a deficiency. This was, he had told Catherine on the fourth morning, the specific cruelty of the scheme beyond the financial consequences. He had said, they built a false version that was designed to suggest your authentic version wasn't good enough. They tried to make your accuracy look like concealment of inadequacy. She had been very still for a moment. She had said, yes, she had said, that's precisely it. She had said, the authentic record is what I have. It's what I've always had. I never claimed more than it showed. They tried to take that and make it into the evidence against me. He had said they failed. She had said, yes. She had said, because of you. He had said, because the authentic record existed. She had said, yes, but you found it. He had said, it was there to be found. This exchange had been the one that stayed with him longest in the months that followed. Not because of any single thing that was said in it, but because of the specific quality of the moment. Two people acknowledging in the specific direct way that honest people acknowledged things, the exact shape of what had happened and what it meant. She had credited him. He had credited the record. Both of them were right, and neither of them had managed the attribution in a way that was less than accurate. He had thought about Amara, who had said that the interesting part was in the middle, between the beginning and the end. The middle in this story was the authentic record, the 4 years of genuine performance that the fabricators had tried to replace, and that had been there all along in the cold storage archive and in the production archive waiting to be found. The beginning was 23 years of honest work. The end was the dismissal and the conviction. The middle was where everything actually lived, the specific transactions, the actual returns, the real numbers that represented the work. He had found the middle. It was exactly what Catherine had said it was. It had been enough. The motion to dismiss was filed on Thursday afternoon, 8 days after the 4:47 call. Robert Huang's filing ran to 147 pages. The core of it was a 43-page evidentiary memorandum that presented, in the methodical sequence Marcus had developed, the complete record of the fabrication. The cold storage extraction event, the service account manipulation sequence, the comparison of authentic and fabricated reporting documents, and the numerical analysis showing that the authentic performance record was fully consistent with the authentic transaction records and directly contradicted the fabricated reporting documents that the SEC had relied on in filing the action. The memorandum also included, in an appendix, Marcus's analysis of the technical sophistication of the fabrication, the specific choices made in constructing the altered documents that were consistent with someone having deep knowledge of Liang Capital's reporting systems, and the choices that were consistent with the involvement of someone with database administrator capabilities. The appendix did not name Thornton or Chen. The naming was in a separate document attached to a criminal referral that Robert filed simultaneously with a different division. The SEC's lead attorney, Douglas Mercer, received the filing on Thursday afternoon. He requested an emergency status conference on Friday morning. The judge granted it. At the status conference, Mercer said that his office needed time to review the new evidence. Robert said that the 60-day review period that had been granted for the restraining order could be used for exactly this purpose, and that Liang Capital's investors were experiencing material harm for every day the restraining order remained in effect. The judge extended the status conference to Monday morning and directed the SEC to provide a response to the evidentiary memorandum by Sunday evening. On Sunday evening, the SEC's response arrived. It was 4 pages. It acknowledged the authenticity of the evidentiary record Marcus had developed. It noted that the SEC's investigation had relied on documents provided by a confidential source and that the investigation into the authenticity of those documents was ongoing. It did not oppose a lifting of the restraining order. The restraining order was lifted on Monday morning. Liang Capital's trading was reinstated at market open. The formal dismissal of the SEC action came 12 days later, after the SEC's internal review confirmed the fabrication and the source. James Thornton was arrested on October 31st. James Chen was arrested on November 3rd. The criminal referral Robert had filed was the foundation of a federal securities fraud and computer fraud indictment that named both men and detailed the fabrication scheme. The indictment relied substantially on the evidence Marcus had developed, cited in the specific form he had documented it. Catherine had read the indictment when it was filed. She had read the citation of Marcus's work, which appeared 7 times in the charging documents. She had called him that evening. She had said, "I want you to know that I read the indictment." He said, "Yes." She said, "The citations are accurate." He said, "Yes." She said, "The documentation you produced is as precise as anything I've seen in a legal filing." He said, "Thank you." She said, "That isn't a compliment, it's an accurate description." He said, "I know, that's why I received it." She had found, over the 12 days between the filing and the dismissal, that her assessment of Marcus Webb had accumulated detail in the specific way her assessments always accumulated detail. Through the evidence of his work, examined carefully, producing conclusions that were either confirmed or revised as additional evidence arrived. The evidence had consistently confirmed the initial assessment. Someone who understood the relationships between things rather than the things themselves, who worked with the methodical completeness that his subject required, and who communicated what he found in the form that was most useful to the person who needed to use it. She had also found in the conversations they had during the 12 days, some of them about the investigation, some of them moving into territory adjacent to the investigation, because the investigation had been the context for finding someone worth talking to, that his quality of listening was the specific kind she had found, in 23 years of professional life, genuinely rare. He was not managing what he heard toward a conclusion he had already reached. He was genuinely processing it, in the way that real thinking required and that most conversation did not provide. She had talked to him about David once briefly, in the context of the regulatory work David had done at the SEC and what it meant that the system that David had believed in was being used against her. She had said this without planning to. It had been a late evening, and the conversation had moved in a direction that was no longer about the investigation. He had received it in the way she had come to expect from him, completely without the managed response that would have required her to manage his feelings about what she had disclosed. He had said, "Was he good at the work?" She had said, "Excellent." He had said, "I'm glad you had someone who was excellent at it." The simplicity of the statement and the accuracy of what it acknowledged, not consolation, not condolence, but the specific recognition of what had been real, had been something she had thought about afterward for longer than she had expected. She had told Marcus in the conversation after the indictment that she was going to offer him a retainer arrangement for ongoing investigative work related to Liang Capital's data security. He had said, "I'd like to hear the terms." She had said, "Robert will send them." He had said, "I'll review them." She had said, "They'll be fair." He had said, "I know." She had said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because you said the Liang Capital performance was accurately reported." He said, "A person who is accurate about the big things is accurate about the terms." She had been quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a generous inference." He said, "It's a logical one." She said, "You'll see." She had been right. The terms were fair. He had accepted. The arrangement had begun in December. The 12 days between the motion to dismiss and the formal dismissal were, for Liang Capital as an organization, the specific period in which the difference between a crisis managed and a crisis survived became visible. A crisis managed produced, at its conclusion, an organization that had returned to its prior state. A crisis survived produced an organization that had changed in specific ways that the crisis had revealed were necessary. The changes at Liang Capital were operational and cultural. The operational changes were the ones Kevin Lee had designed and implemented: the archive security revisions, the access monitoring enhancements, the vendor security assessment protocol. These were concrete, documentable, and could be presented to regulators and investors as evidence that the specific vulnerability that had been exploited had been addressed. The cultural changes were less concrete, but in Catherine's assessment, more significant. She had in the 12 days watched 17 people manage a crisis that was not of their making with the specific quality that told her something about what the organization's culture had actually produced. The analysts had continued their work, not trading work, which was frozen, but the research and model development that was always in progress, and that did not require the trading capability to proceed. The operational staff had managed the investor communications with the precision she had asked for. Kevin Lee had worked 18-hour days without being asked to, and without making the hours visible in any way that required her to manage her response to them. These were the people the culture had produced. They were, she had thought during the 12 days, the authentic thing too, the product of 23 years of building an organization around specific values and finding people who shared them. The fabrication had threatened the financial foundation of the organization. It had not touched the human foundation, which was what the organization actually was. She had said this to Marcus on the evening the dismissal was confirmed, in a conversation that had been, after the professional business of the confirmation, one of the more personal of the conversations they had had. She had said, "The organization that came through the 12 days is better than the organization that entered them." Not because the crisis was good, it was genuinely harmful in the ways I've described. but because the crisis made visible what was actually there, and what was actually there was sounder than I had allowed myself to know. He had said, "You knew," she had said, "I knew in the intellectual sense." He said, "What's the other sense?" she said. "The sense in which you're allowed to believe something without feeling that believing it is a form of pride or complacency." She said, "I knew the organization was sound. I hadn't been willing to hold it as a certainty because holding it as a certainty felt like the kind of confidence that preceded a fall." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I have evidence." He said, "Yes." She said, "Evidence is different from faith." He said, "Yes." She said, "I find evidence more comfortable." He said, "I know." He said it with the specific quality of recognition between two people who had found they understood the same thing from the inside. She had said, "Thank you for producing it." He had said, "The organization produced it. I found where it was." She had said, "You found it in 4 days." He had said, "I knew what I was looking for." She had said, "Because I described it accurately." He had said, "Yes." She said, "We needed each other." He said, "Yes." She said, "I find that a more satisfying description of what happened than either of us having done it alone." He had said, "So do I." This was, he had thought afterward, the specific quality of the conversation that made it different from the professional conversations that had preceded it. The willingness to say the accurate thing about the relationship between the two of them and what it had produced, without managing the statement toward a form that was smaller or larger than what was actually true. They had needed each other. The investigation had required both of them. The authentic thing was found because both of them were in the work. He had driven home that evening thinking about accuracy as a form of intimacy, the specific intimacy of saying precisely what was true to someone who received precisely what was true and reflected it back with equal precision. It was the rarest form of intimacy he had encountered, and it was more available in the presence of genuine intellectual compatibility than in any other context he had found. He was in the presence of it. He intended to remain in the presence of it. The form would develop in the form it developed. Section 9, December. What the MONTHS produced December in Portland had the specific quality of a month that had decided to be fully itself without apology. The darkness arriving before 5 in the afternoon, the rain consistent rather than intermittent, the city settling into the indoor season that the Pacific Northwest managed better than most places because it had long since made peace with the indoor season as a feature rather than a concession. Marcus had grown up in this weather and had the specific relationship with it that people developed who had never been somewhere consistently warmer. He did not dislike the dark months. He found in them the specific quality of interiority, the turning of attention inward and toward what was close, that was more available in winter than in the long green summer. The December that followed the Liang Capital investigation had the particular quality of a month that contained more than its usual content. The retainer arrangement had begun, which meant a regular, structured professional relationship with one of the more unusual clients he had worked for. Unusual not in the complexity of the work, which was within the range of what he had done before, but in the quality of the client's engagement with it. Catherine Liang approached the work the way she had approached the evidence review, specifically, accurately, without management of the information toward a preferred conclusion. She asked the questions that needed asking. She received the answers with full attention. She made decisions quickly once she had the complete picture. They had, over the December conversations, also moved into territory that was adjacent to the professional relationship in the specific way that genuine intellectual compatibility moved people, toward the actual thoughts rather than the managed versions of them. She had told him in a conversation about the regulatory framework for investment fund reporting that the SEC investigation had produced a specific and unexpected clarity about what the firm was for, not only the investment mission, which was clear, but the specific form of trust that the firm's relationship with its investors embodied and that Thornton and Chen had attempted to weaponize against the firm. She said, they were trying to use the trust as the mechanism of the fraud. The SEC filing would not have been credible if Liang Capital hadn't had a reputation for transparency. The reputation was the target, not just the instrument. He said, "That's a precise observation." She said, "It's an accurate one." She said, "I've been thinking about what David would have made of it." He said, "What do you think he would have made of it?" She said, "He would have said that trust-based institutions are uniquely vulnerable to trust-based attacks because the defense against a trust-based attack requires the institution to demonstrate the thing that is being attacked, rather than the thing that's being denied." He said, "Explain." She said, "The defense against a financial fraud allegation that relies on performance manipulation is to demonstrate the authentic performance. The authentic performance is the trust that Liang Capital's investors have placed in the firm. The defense uses the thing being attacked as the evidence." He said, "Which means the defense succeeds only if the trust was genuine." She said, "Yes." He said, "It was." She said, "I know." He had thought about this conversation for several days. He had thought about it in the specific way he thought about the best conversations, as a pattern worth turning over and examining from different angles, because the pattern contained something that had not been visible on first contact, but that became more visible the more it was looked at. What the pattern contained was this: the investigation had succeeded because the authentic record existed. The authentic record existed because Catherine Liang had, for 23 years, reported her performance accurately even when the incentive structure of the industry rewarded inaccuracy. The accuracy was not a defensive strategy. It was the specific expression of how she ran the firm, built into every operational decision from the beginning. The investigation had found the authentic record because Marcus had looked at the relationships between documents rather than the documents themselves. The relationships pointed to the authentic record because the authentic record was there to point to. The fabrication had failed because the authentic thing existed. This was, he thought, the most fundamental structural principle available. A fabrication could not survive indefinitely in the presence of the authentic thing it was attempting to replace. The authentic thing found and documented collapsed the fabrication. The investigation was the finding. The authentic thing was what had been built over 23 years. He told this to Zara in the form available to a 7-year-old, which was the form of a story. Someone had tried to replace a real thing with a fake version, and the way to show the fake was to find the real thing. Zara said, "Why didn't they just get rid of the real thing?" He said, "Because they didn't know exactly where it was," she said. "But you did," he said. "I knew what it was." "That's different," she said. "How is that different?" He said, "If you know what the real thing is, you know where to look for it. If you only know the fake thing, you don't know what you're looking for." She thought about this. She said, "You had to know the real thing to find it." He said, "Yes." She said, "How did you know the real thing?" He said, "Because I talked to the person who made it." She said, "That's why you went to see her." He said, "Yes, that's exactly why." He had been thinking in December about what the next year looked like. Not as a destination, but as a direction, the specific orientation that the last 3 months had clarified. He had the retainer. He had the independent practice, which had, through the Liang Capital case and the referrals it had generated, reached a level of stability that was different in kind from the stability of the previous 2 years. He had Zara, who was growing in the direction of her specific self with the pace that children grew at, which was faster than adults expected and exactly as fast as it needed to be. He had also, in the December conversations with Catherine, found himself thinking about the thing he had found with Amara and had not expected to find again, the specific quality of a person who improved his thinking by being in it. He was careful with this thought. He had been careful with most significant thoughts since Amara died, which was part of the specific education that loss produced in people who were honest with it. The understanding that careful was not the same as closed, and that being in the presence of something worth attending to required the willingness to attend. He was attending. He was allowing what was developing to develop at the pace it was developing without managing it toward a form he had predetermined. This was the same orientation he brought to the investigative work. You did not manage the evidence toward a conclusion you had already reached. You followed it where it went and you trusted the process to produce what was actually there. He trusted the process. He did not yet know the form. He was paying attention. The retainer arrangement had, in its first month of operation, produced 2 smaller investigations. A review of access patterns following a staff departure in Liang Capital's New York office, which had turned up no anomalies and had been concluded within 3 days, and a vendor security assessment for a new data provider the fund was considering onboarding, which had produced 3 findings that Kevin Lee had used to negotiate stronger contractual security protections with the vendor. Both engagements were, relative to the October investigation, operationally routine. Both confirmed the value of the retainer structure. Having someone who understood the firm's specific data architecture and access environment available for ongoing security review was categorically different from engaging a forensic investigator after a problem had manifested. Catherine had said in one of the December conversations, "I've been thinking about the specific way the October investigation succeeded and what it says about the value of the retainer going forward." He had said, "Tell me." She had said, "It succeeded because you understood the relationship between the components of the evidence set before you began looking for the evidence. That understanding was available to you because I described the situation accurately in the first meeting, and because you asked the right question given that accurate description." She said, "The retainer reproduces the conditions that made the October investigation possible. You understand the firm's architecture now. You don't need the first meeting to orient. The right question will be more accessible because you already know the system." He had said that's the analytical case for ongoing relationship rather than episodic engagement. She had said, "Yes," he had said, "it's also the case I would have made if you'd asked me to make the business case for the retainer." She had said, "I know," she had said, "I made it first because the logic was available to me without asking." He had said, "Yes," she said, "Is that relevant?" He had said, "It's relevant to my assessment of the quality of the relationship." She had said, "Good." She had said, "I find the quality of the relationship relevant to my assessment too." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I wanted to say so." He had said, "I know." He had said, "So did I." These exchanges, the specific quality of 2 people who found the same thing significant and said so directly, without the managed version of the directness that professional courtesy often required, were what had accumulated over the December conversations into the specific condition Marcus had been careful about naming too quickly. He had been careful because naming too quickly was its own form of misrepresentation. It assigned a form to something that was still becoming a form, and the assignment of form before the form was ready was what produced the managed version rather than the accurate one. He had been in this condition before in a different and earlier version with Amara. He knew what it felt like when it was real, and he knew what it felt like when it was the managed version of the real thing. What he was experiencing with Catherine was the real version, the slow accumulation of evidence about another person's specific quality, building into an assessment that was supported by the evidence and that he was not managing toward a predetermined conclusion. He also knew that the real version and the managed version looked from outside the experience almost identical. The difference was inside. The real version felt like discovering something that was already there, which it was. The managed version felt like constructing something that you wanted to be there, which was a different thing and produced in Marcus's experience a different quality of result. He was discovering something. He was paying attention to it. He was not yet ready to name the full shape of it because the full shape was still becoming visible, and naming it before it was visible was the specific form of inaccuracy he was most careful about. He was patient. The investigation had taught him something specific about patience. The willingness to wait for the evidence to fully present itself, rather than reaching for the conclusion before it was supported, was what produced the accurate answer. He had applied this to documents. He was applying it to this. The methodology was the same. Section 10, Analytical Layer. The right question. The investigation at the center of this story succeeded for a specific reason that is worth examining precisely, because the reason is not the one that most narratives about fraud investigations emphasize. Most fraud investigation narratives emphasize the investigator's cleverness, the specific insight that cracked the case, the technique that no one else had applied, the intuition that pointed in the right direction when all the conventional approaches had failed. These narratives are compelling. They are also, in Marcus Webb's experience of 9 years of investigative work, mostly inaccurate as descriptions of how investigations actually succeeded. Investigations succeeded when the investigator asked the right question before beginning the work, because the right question determined what you were looking for, which determined where you looked, which determined what you found. The wrong question produced a search for evidence of the theory you already held. The right question produced a search for the actual condition of the system you were examining, whatever that condition turned out to be. Marcus had asked the right question on the evening of his first meeting with Catherine. Was the metadata on the transaction records in the SEC filing the same as the metadata on the fabricated reporting documents, or different? This question did not assume fraud or its absence. It asked about the relationship between two components of the evidence set, because the relationship between components was where the system's actual condition was visible. The answer that the metadata was different, confirming the transaction records were authentic while the reporting documents were fabricated, had changed the entire shape of the investigation. Instead of looking for where the fabrication was, Marcus was looking for where the authentic records had come from and how they had been obtained. This was a different investigation, with a different starting point, which led to the cold storage archive, which led to the bulk export event, which led to the service account modification, which led to James Chen. The question had been available to Robert's forensics team for 8 hours before Marcus arrived. They had not asked it not because they were less skilled than Marcus, but because they were operating from the investigation theory that the SEC had implied, that the documents were fabricated and the forensics task was to find the fabrication. Marcus had not had the investigation theory when he read the filing in the car. He had read it as a system and asked what the relationship between the components told him about the system's condition. The relationship had told him what the right question was. This is the analytical principle. The evidence that matters most in a complex document fraud is not in any single document. It is in the relationships between documents, the way different components of the evidence set were produced, and whether those production processes were consistent with each other or whether they diverged in ways that revealed something about their origins. This principle had been available to Marcus because of the specific training he had received from Harold Stein, who had said in 2004, "Most people look at documents. You need to look at the relationships between documents." Harold had said, "The document is a snapshot. The relationship between documents is the movie. You cannot understand the movie from a single frame." Marcus had applied this principle across 9 years of investigative work, and it had produced findings that the single document approach had missed in every case where it mattered. He had applied it to the Liang Capital case in exactly this form. The relationship between the fabricated reporting documents and the authentic transaction records was the evidence. Not the documents themselves, which would have been individually ambiguous, but the relationship between them, which was unambiguous once it was articulated and examined. This analytical principle was not specific to document fraud. It was specific to systems. Any complex system where the condition of the system was not fully visible in any single component and was most legible in the relationships between components. Catherine had recognized this immediately because Wei Lin's circuit diagrams had taught her the same principle in a different technical domain. The behavior of the circuit was not in any single component. It was in the connections. You understood a circuit by understanding the relationships between its parts. The recognition had been mutual and immediate, and it had been the foundation of the specific quality of their working relationship. Two people operating from the same analytical framework, applied across different domains, finding in the overlap a quality of intellectual compatibility that neither had expected from a fraud investigation engagement. This was not the lesson of the story. The lesson of the story was simpler. The authentic thing existed, the evidence was found, the fabrication failed. The intellectual compatibility was a consequence of the investigation, not its purpose. But it was, in Marcus's honest accounting of what the months had produced and what the December conversations had begun to reveal, one of the more significant consequences available. He was not managing it toward a predetermined form. He was simply noting that it was there. There is also a specific dimension of the analytical principle worth examining in relation to the broader pattern of fraud in complex institutional settings. The pattern that Marcus had identified, authentic records weaponized alongside fabricated records to produce a false narrative, was not unique to the Liang Capital case. It was a technique that had appeared in various forms in several of the financial document fraud cases Harold had worked, and in at least two of the cases Marcus had handled independently. The technique's effectiveness derived from a specific property of how investigators and regulators approached complex evidence sets, the tendency to treat the internal consistency of the fabricated portion as evidence of authenticity. Internal consistency was, in fact, a weak indicator of authenticity in sophisticated fabrications. A skilled fabricator who understood the system being fabricated could produce internal consistency easily. They had built the fabrication to be internally consistent. The more reliable indicator was the consistency between the fabricated portion and the authentic portion, because this consistency was much harder to engineer. It required the fabricator to understand not only the fabricated system, but the authentic system well enough to match them. Thornton had understood the reporting system well enough to build a fabricated version. He had not understood the causal architecture well enough to build a version that matched the authentic transaction records at the causal level. The mismatch was where the fabrication was visible. Marcus had written a brief document after the case was resolved, not for publication, but for Harold's reference library, which Harold had been building for 20 years as a resource for the investigators he trained. The document described the authentic records alongside fabricated records technique, the specific indicators that distinguished it from a purely fabricated evidence set, and the investigative approach that was most effective for finding the authentic records and using them to expose the fabrication. Harold had called him after reading it. He had said, "This is the best thing you've written." Marcus had said, "It's the best case I've worked." Harold had said, "I know." He had said the technique is more common than people think. He had said, "Most of the financial fraud cases I've seen in the last 5 years have some version of this." He had said, "The authentic record is always somewhere. The question is always where and who has access to it." He had said, "You found it faster than anyone I've watched work this kind of case." Marcus had said, "I asked the right question at the beginning." Harold had said, "Yes." He had said, "That's always the whole thing." Marcus had said, "Yes." The document had in the following year been circulated through Harold's training network to 12 investigators in the Pacific Northwest and shared, through Harold's connections, with 2 forensic accounting firms and 1 federal regulatory office. The specific technique it described and the methodology it recommended had become, in those contexts, part of how investigators approached complex document fraud cases. The Liang Capital case had improved the practice in the small and cumulative and invisible way that good cases improved practice, through the specific learning they produced, transmitted through the specific channels available to the specific people who needed to know it. Marcus had not published the document. He had not sought credit for the improvement to the practice. He had given it to Harold, who had given it to the training network, and the network had used it. This was exactly what it was supposed to be. The work done, the learning documented, the documentation transmitted to the people who needed it. The buildings hold, the records stand, the practice improves. That is what honest work accumulated into. The Thornton and Chen prosecution proceeded over the following year with the specific pace of federal criminal cases, methodical, comprehensive, and bounded by procedural requirements that produced a timeline measured in months rather than weeks. Both men were indicted in November, arraigned in December, and entered not guilty pleas that their attorneys had advised as the appropriate response, while the discovery process produced the full evidentiary record. The full evidentiary record was, when produced in discovery, substantially larger than the evidence Marcus had developed. The FBI's forensic accountants working from Marcus's foundation had traced the full arc of the scheme. The planning conversations between Thornton and Chen, documented in encrypted messaging platforms that the FBI had obtained through a separate warrant process. The commission structure through which Thornton had been promised a percentage of the proceeds from a short position that a third party had taken in Liang Capital's publicly traded affiliated fund during the period of the SEC action. And the specific timeline of the fabrication, which had begun 5 months before the SEC filing and which had required, in total, 63 hours of technical work across 14 sessions. Thornton had not improvised. He had planned the fabrication with the same technical rigor he had applied to the quantitative models he had built for Liang Capital for 8 years. The irony of this was not lost on the attorneys who reviewed the discovery, or on Catherine, who noted it without the specific emotion the irony might have warranted because the irony was accurate and she was by disposition more interested in accuracy than in emotion. She had said to Marcus, reading the discovery summary, "He used the methodology I hired him for to build the fraud." He had said, "Yes," she had said, "that's the specific shape of betrayal, isn't it? Not the person you didn't know." "The person you trained," he had said. "Yes," she had said, "I've been thinking about whether there was a point at which I could have known." He said, "Probably not." He said, "The methodology for this kind of fraud requires the specific domain knowledge your role gave him. Without the role he couldn't have done it. The vulnerability was inherent to the trust relationship." She had been quiet for a moment. She said, "That's not consoling." He said, "It wasn't intended to be." He said, "It's accurate." She said, "Yes. That's why I wanted to hear it." The trial was scheduled for the following September, a year after the original SEC filing. Both Thornton and Chen had, by the spring, received plea offers from the prosecution. Thornton's attorney had indicated that his client was considering the offer. Chen's attorney had been less communicative about his client's position. The prosecution was prepared for trial either way. Liang Capital had, by March of the year following the investigation, fully resumed normal operations. The SEC action had been dismissed with prejudice in November, following the SEC's own internal investigation confirming the fabrication and the source. The restraining order period had cost the fund approximately $23 million in execution timing losses of positions that had needed to be managed rather than executed during the frozen period, at costs that were less than optimal. The $23 million was, in Catherine's assessment, the specific financial measure of what the scheme had cost the firm and indirectly its investors. She had in March disclosed the full account of the SEC action, the investigation, and the dismissal to the fund's investors in a letter that ran to 12 pages, and that described the events with the same precision and transparency that she had applied to performance reporting for 23 years. The letter included a summary of Marcus's investigative findings, attributed correctly. It included the cost estimate for the frozen period. It included her assessment of the organizational changes she had implemented to strengthen the firm's data security and access controls. 17 of the fund's 22 institutional investors had responded to the letter with written acknowledgments. 9 of them had made additional capital commitments in the 3 months following the dismissal, which was, in the investment fund context, the specific form of trust that letters did not produce and track records produced over time. The additional commitments were not the largest she had received. They were, she had told Marcus, the ones that mattered most because they came after the most transparent account of vulnerability that she had ever provided to investors, and the response had been to trust more rather than less. She had said, "I spent 23 years building a reputation for transparency. I spent 12 days wondering if the reputation was going to survive a fabricated attack on it." She said, "The reputation survived." He said, "The reputation survived because it was accurate." She said, "Yes," he said, "accuracy is the only thing that survives long enough to matter." She said, "David used to say that." He said, "He was right." She said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I find I tell you that often." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that uncomfortable?" He said, "No." He said, "I find the specific quality of someone who is still in conversation with someone they've lost to be one of the more valuable things I've encountered." She said, "Amara." He said, "Yes." She said, "How long did it take before the conversations you had with her didn't feel like conversations with an absence?" He thought about this honestly. He said, "I'm not sure they've stopped being conversations with her absence. I think I've gotten better at having both conversations at once." She said, "Yes." She said, "That's exactly it." These conversations, which had developed alongside and within the professional relationship, were by March something that neither of them was managing toward a predetermined form. They were simply what was happening in the available form at the pace it was developing. This was, Marcus had decided, the appropriate orientation. The appropriate orientation did not require a declaration or a plan. It required attention, and he was paying it. The prosecution also produced, in the federal trial preparation process, a specific finding that Marcus had not fully anticipated when he developed the initial investigation. The scheme had been funded externally. The third party who had taken the short position in Liang Capital's publicly traded affiliated fund, the party who had stood to profit from the collapse of the fund's reputation that the SEC action was intended to produce, was a competitor fund manager named Elliot Marsh, who had been trading against Liang Capital's strategy for several years and who had identified, in Thornton's termination and visible bitterness, an opportunity to accelerate a competitive advantage. Marsh had not designed the scheme. He had funded it. His relationship with Thornton had been through an intermediary, and the communications were encrypted and careful in the way of communications between sophisticated parties who understood that they were crossing lines and wanted the crossing to be difficult to trace. The FBI had traced it anyway through the financial records of the short position, through the payment structure Marsh had used to compensate Thornton, through the specific timing of the position initiation relative to the SEC filing that was precise enough to be explainable only by advanced knowledge of the filing date. Marsh had been charged separately in a parallel indictment with conspiracy to commit securities fraud. His case had attracted considerably more public attention than Thornton's and Chen's, because a hedge fund manager conspiring to destroy a competitor's reputation through a fabricated regulatory action was a more dramatic narrative than a disgruntled former employee and a complicit IT manager, and the financial press had found it so. The additional indictment had also produced a specific consequence for Liang Capital that Catherine had not anticipated. The investor response to the news of Marsh's involvement had been different in character from the investor response to the news of Thornton's. The Thornton story had produced concern, the fund had been attacked from within, and the question of whether the internal security architecture was adequate was a legitimate question with a legitimate answer, and the investors who asked it had received the legitimate answer. The Marsh story had produced something closer to solidarity. A competitor had attempted to destroy a fund through a fabricated regulatory action, and the fund had survived, and the investors who had stayed through the freeze understood themselves to have been part of the survival in the specific way that institutional investors felt when the thing they had invested in demonstrated the resilience they had originally believed it had. 3 additional institutional investors had made capital commitments in the 2 months following the Marsh indictment. The fund's total assets under management had, by March of the following year, exceeded $4.5 billion, the highest in the fund's history. Catherine had noted this to Marcus in one of the March conversations, without the specific emotion the data might have warranted, because she was not a person who marked financial milestones with emotion. She was a person who marked them with data, she had said. The assets under management are at a historical high. He had said, that's good. She had said, yes. She had said, I think it's worth noting what produced it. He said, accurate performance reporting over 23 years, she said, and the investigation that defended it. He said, the investigation found the authentic thing. The authentic thing was what produced the assets under management. She said, that's a precise distinction. He said, I think it's the right one. She said, I agree. She said, the investigation was the service. The authentic thing was the substance. He said, yes. She said, I want both. He had understood what she meant. The retainer was the service. The ongoing relationship was the substance. Both were present. Both were real. Both were what they were in the form they were, and neither required management toward a form that was more or less than what was actually there. He was not managing. He was paying attention. The evidence was accumulating. The September of the following year arrived with the specific quality that Portland Septembers had before the summer had fully conceded. Warm enough in the afternoons to be outdoor weather, cool enough in the mornings to be indoor weather. The light at an angle that was different from July's light in a way that was atmospheric rather than purely astronomical. Thornton had taken the plea offer in August. His attorney had communicated the decision with the specific brevity of a negotiation that had been concluded. Thornton would plead guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud, 1 count of computer fraud, and 1 count of obstruction of justice. The sentencing guidelines put his exposure at 42 to 52 months of federal custody. The prosecution had accepted the plea in exchange for Thornton's full cooperation in the case against Chen, whose attorney had not communicated a comparable willingness. Chen's trial began in September. It lasted 3 weeks. Marcus testified on the 3rd day, presenting the cold storage archive analysis in the form he had documented it in October of the previous year, the extraction event, the service account sequence, the obfuscation methodology. He was in the witness chair for 4 hours, including cross-examination by Chen's attorney, which had been vigorous and specific. The cross-examination had attacked the interpretation of the service account access log, arguing that the 4 manual operations in the pre-export sequence could have been performed by any of the 3 people with service account credentials and did not uniquely identify Chen. Marcus had acknowledged the limitation clearly. The service account log did not contain biometric authentication, so it did not uniquely identify which of the 3 credentialed individuals had performed the manual operations. He had then presented the additional evidence he had developed in the months since October, a behavioral analysis of the access patterns across all 3 credentialed individuals over the previous 2 years, showing that the access pattern on the night in question, the specific sequence of operations, the timing intervals, the operation ordering was consistent with Chen's historical access patterns and inconsistent with the other 2 credentialed individuals' patterns. The behavioral analysis did not prove Chen performed the operations. It made the hypothesis that one of the other 2 had performed them substantially less likely than the hypothesis that Chen had. The jury had deliberated for 2 days. They had convicted Chen on all counts. He was sentenced in December to 61 months of federal custody, the upper end of the guidelines range, with the judge noting in the sentencing statement that the sophistication of the scheme and the specific use of a position of organizational trust to facilitate the fraud warranted the higher end of the range. Catherine had attended the conviction, seated in the gallery in the specific quiet way of someone who was present to witness something that was complete rather than to perform a response to it. Marcus had not been in the courtroom for the verdict. He had been at Zara's school for an event that had been scheduled for 2 months. He had received a text from Catherine that evening that said, "Chen convicted, all counts." He had replied good, she had replied yes. He had been, by the time of the conviction, in the specific condition of someone who had, over a year of working relationship and developing conversation, arrived at an honest assessment of what was between himself and Catherine Liang, and had decided that the honest assessment warranted being said rather than remaining in the territory of unacknowledged things. He had said it in October, on an evening that was specifically an evening rather than a professional meeting, which was itself a distinction that had developed gradually over the year and that both of them had noted without formally naming. He had said, "I want to be honest about something." She had said, yes, he had said, "The professional relationship has been good." He said, "The conversations have been different from good." He said, "I'm telling you this because I think you know it and because leaving it in the background felt like a form of inaccuracy that I wasn't comfortable with." She had been quiet for a moment, in the way she went quiet when something accurate had been said, and she was deciding how to receive it fully rather than managing toward a response. She had said, "The conversations have been different from good for me too." She said, "I have been in the specific condition of someone who is paying full attention to something she is not sure how to name." She said, "I find this condition to be simultaneously appropriate and insufficient." He said, "Yes, that's exactly it." She said, "I think the insufficiency is navigable." He said, "I think so too." She said, "That's not a declaration." He said, "I know." She said, "It's a direction." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's enough for now." He said, "Yes." They sat in the October evening, in the workspace with the 2 walls of windows and the city below, in the specific quality of a room where something has been said and received accurately, and where neither person has felt the need to immediately convert the saying and the receiving into a form that was larger or more certain than what was actually true. He drove home. He checked on Zara, who was asleep with the specific total commitment of a 7-year-old who had been fully awake all day. He sat in the kitchen for a while, in the ambient quiet of the house that he had shared with Amara, and now shared with Zara and now was beginning, in the specific incremental way that beginnings happened in lives that had already been through significant loss, to think of differently. He thought about Gloria at the reference desk, 26 years of finding the accurate record in the system where it was kept. He thought about Harold, who had said that the investigation was about the paper trail, about finding where someone had tried to erase the paper and understanding the specific shape of the erasure. He thought about Amara, who had said the interesting part was in the middle, between the beginning and the end, where people didn't think to look. He had been in the middle of something for a year. He had been paying attention to it, in the way he paid attention to the relationships between components in any complex system, which was to say carefully and without managing toward a predetermined form. The form was not yet fully visible. The direction was clear. He thought, that's enough, that's what you need, not the full form. The right direction, paid attention to in the available time. He went to bed. The October night did what October nights in Portland did, which was to be complete and present and specific without apology in the way of things that had decided to be fully themselves. The trial had also produced in its public record something that Catherine had not anticipated, but that she found, reading it afterward, to be the most precise account available of what had actually been done to her firm. The charging documents, the expert testimony, the forensic accounting analysis that the FBI team had developed from Marcus's foundation. These were the specific, documented record of the scheme, in the form that a federal court had accepted as the basis for conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. This was, she had realized, the form of the authentic record she had not been able to produce herself. Not the fund's performance record, which she had always had, but the record of what had been done to her. The authentic record of the fraud. She had known from the 447 call forward that the fraud was real and that it had been perpetrated by specific people with specific methods for specific reasons. She had not had the documented, legally established, publicly accessible record of this knowledge until the trial produced it. She had read the sentencing statement the judge had issued with the Chen conviction. The statement had described, in the specific language that federal sentencing required, the nature and scope of the offense. It had said, the defendant, using his position of organizational trust, provided the technical capability that made possible a fraud scheme designed to destroy the professional reputation of an individual who had spent 23 years building a legitimate investment business through honest work. The scheme's sophistication indicated planning and deliberate intent. The defendant's cooperation in the scheme required him to act against the interests of the organization that had employed him and trusted him with access to its most sensitive systems. She had read this paragraph 3 times, not because the content surprised her, she had known all of it for a year, but because the specific form of it mattered. It was a federal court statement in the public record of what had happened and who had done it. The authentic record of the fraud existed. It was in the public record. It could not be modified. She had told Marcus about this in the October conversation when she had said that the investigation had produced something she had not known she needed. He had said, "Tell me." She had said, "The performance record I had before the investigation was my own private certainty." She said, "The investigation produced the public record." He said, "The legal record." She said, "Yes." She said, "There is a specific difference between knowing something privately and having the knowledge in the form that the world can verify independently." He said, "The circuit." She said, "Explain." He said, "The information is not only in the components, it is in the relationships between the components. The private knowledge is the component, the public record is the relationship, the thing that makes the private knowledge available to anyone who looks." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes, that's exact." She said, "David used to talk about this in regulatory terms. He used to say that the purpose of the regulatory record was not to contain information but to make information verifiable by people who weren't present when it was produced." He said, "The trial produced the verifiable record." She said, "Yes." She said, "I find that I needed it." He said, "I know." This conversation had been, she thought afterward, the moment in which the year had completed itself. Not the conviction, which was the legal completion, but the conversation, which was the human completion. She had said what she needed to say to someone who understood what she was saying in the full sense of the word understood. Not only the content but the weight of it, the specific importance of having the authentic record of what had been done to her in the form that the world could independently verify. He had understood it because he had been the one who found the authentic performance record, which was the foundation on which the legal record had been built. He had understood what the legal record meant to her because he understood what had been necessary to produce it. She had said, "Thank you." She had said it simply and directly without qualification or elaboration in the way that she said things that were accurate and complete and did not need to be larger than they were. He had said, "Yes." That was the whole of it. The authentic thing existed. The record was in place. The work had been done correctly. The year had produced what it needed to produce. Here is what this story is actually about, stated clearly before it ends. It is not about the fraud investigation, though the investigation is the mechanism. It is not about the conviction, though the conviction is the outcome. It is not about a wealthy CEO rescued by a humble investigator, though the surface narrative has that shape and that shape is real enough to be true in its basic facts. It is about the specific quality of authentic things and what happens when authentic things are threatened by fabricated replacements, and what is required to find the authentic thing when the fabricated version has been designed to obscure it. Catherine Liang built an authentic performance record over 23 years. She built it by doing accurate work, reporting it accurately, and maintaining the accuracy even when the industry rewarded inflation. The authentic record was not a strategic asset she had built as a defense against future fraud. It was simply what was there, the product of how she ran the firm, accumulated into a 23-year record that turned out, when threatened, to be exactly what was needed to survive the threat. This is the fundamental structural point. The authentic thing is its own defense. You cannot fabricate something convincingly in the presence of the authentic original because the authentic original will always contain more internal consistency, more true detail, more genuine coherence than the fabricated version. The fabrication can be sophisticated. It can be technically excellent. It will still fail when the authentic thing is found and placed beside it, because the fabrication cannot account for everything the authentic thing contains. Marcus found the authentic thing. He found it by asking the right question before beginning the search, which was the question about the relationship between the two components of the evidence set rather than the question about what was wrong with either component. The relationship revealed the asymmetry. One component was authentic, one was fabricated, and the asymmetry was the evidence. This is the investigator's principle, stated in its most general form. You find what you're looking for when you understand what it is before you look for it. Marcus understood that the authentic record existed, that it was somewhere in the system, and that the system's access logs would contain the evidence of how the authentic record had been extracted and weaponized. He understood this because he asked the question that positioned the authentic record as the thing to be found rather than the fabrication as the thing to be analyzed. The question came from a specific disposition toward evidence, the disposition of someone who has been trained to look at the relationships between things rather than the things themselves. Harold had taught this. Gloria had demonstrated it at a reference desk for 26 years in the form of finding the accurate record in the system where it actually was rather than where the patron thought it might be. These things connected in Marcus's practice into a methodology that was consistent across very different domains. Document fraud, financial records, the specific question of where things were that people wanted to remain unfound. The methodology was always the same. The relationship between components told you more than the components themselves. You followed the relationships until the actual condition of the system was visible. The actual condition of the system that was Liang Capital was, the performance was what it had been reported to be. The authentic record confirmed this in every detail. The fabrication placed beside the authentic record failed. What Catherine had built over 23 years, the accuracy, the transparency, the consistent honesty about what the firm's performance actually was not a defensive strategy. It was the way she had decided to run the firm. It was, as Marcus had said, an accurate thing, and accuracy was what survived long enough to matter. David Park,